There are some stories so unsettling, so deeply disturbing, that even the most popular streaming services won't touch them. There are some stories so unsettling, so deeply disturbing, that even the most popular streaming services won't touch them. These aren't tales of fiction. They're the chilling realities left behind by men who tried to freeze time, to capture life, or to orchestrate fear. From a cabin filled with macabre mannequins to a family preserved forever in front of a television screen, these cases venture into a darkness that's almost impossible to comprehend. Today, we're uncovering the stories of 5 men whose obsessions created legacies of pure terror. Let's start in 1999, deep in the wooded outskirts of Idaho. It was a smell that first alerted to hikers to something terribly wrong. They assumed it was just an animal carcass, but the odor was different, a heavy, sour stench that seemed to cling to the air. It led them to a small, isolated cabin, padlocked from the outside. When local sheriffs arrived and broke the lock, the air that poured out was thick and suffocating, like death and rot layered over years of silence. Inside, the cabin looked like a time capsule. Dust motes hung suspended in the stale air. Furniture was draped in plastic sheets, and the windows were sealed shut with boards and duct tape. But it was the far corner of the main room that drew their immediate attention. A wooden door, without a knob, was chained shut from the outside. With a final effort, they broke it open. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing a scene straight from a nightmare. 7 mannequins were arranged in a half circle around an empty chair. Each one was dressed in real clothes, faded dresses, torn blouses, and old cardigans. But the truly horrifying detail was that the mannequins weren't entirely fake. Every single one had been crudely adorned with human hair, fingernails, and teeth. Someone had tried to make them lifelike, but their faces were blank, their eyes hollow, a failed and grotesque attempt to rebuild the dead. Pinned above each figure was a photograph of a woman, cut from newspapers or printed in grainy black and white. Many of the names matched missing persons from nearby counties, women who had vanished years ago. The cabin's owner was identified as Harold Price, a reclusive handyman who himself had disappeared in 1997. Neighbors described him as quiet, polite, and never in trouble, the kind of person who could live beside you for 20 years and leave no trace behind. As investigators searched the property, they found a generator still connected to a camera on a tripod, aimed directly at the mannequins. Stacked neatly beside it were dozens of videotapes, each labeled with a date and a name. When they played the tapes, the sound was even more disturbing than the images. Harold's voice filled the dark room, a low whisper, repeating each woman's name over and over before saying the same chilling phrase, "Now you rehome." In a freezer, they discovered glass jars filled with preserved fragments of hair and teeth, each tagged with initials. DNA testing confirmed they belonged to women who had vanished across the state between 1992 and 1997. Their bodies were never found. One jar held a lock of blonde hair labeled KT, a match to Karen Tate, a young teacher who disappeared after her car was found abandoned near that very forest. The most unsettling discovery came from the final tape, dated March 3, 1997, the same week Harold Price vanished. The footage showed the room just as it had been found, but one mannequin was missing from the circle. The camera then tilted down slowly, showing Harold's shadow moving toward the now empty chair. And then, the tape went black. The case never officially closed. No trace of Harold Price was ever found. But for years, when spring thawed the forest, hikers swore they could still smell that same sour odor drifting through the trees, faint, but unmistakable, as if the cabin itself never truly stopped breathing. Now, let's travel to Missouri. In 2006, when deputies were called to perform a welfare check on the Murphy family, they expected a routine visit. John, Ellen, and their 2 teenage children hadn't been seen in over a year. Mail was piled high, the grass was wild, and their cars sat motionless in the driveway. Neighbors just assumed they had moved away without a word. When police forced their way in, the smell of decay mixed with a faint, sweet mildew hit them instantly. The house was frozen in time. Dinner plates were still on the table, a pot sat on the stove, and a wall clock ticked on, its old batteries somehow still working. The upstairs bedrooms looked untouched, beds made, clothes in closets. But the silence felt heavy, wrong. It was in the basement that the atmosphere shifted. The air was colder, wetter. A single bulb flickered, casting eerie light on a room that seemed oddly small for the house. An officer tapped on the far wall, and the sound came back hollow. They pried off a section of wood paneling to reveal a hidden door, nailed shut from the outside. What they found behind it was beyond comprehension. Inside the secret room were 4 chairs, bolted to the concrete floor. On the wall, a small television played a looping home video, birthday parties, Christmas mornings, summer picnics. The sound of children's laughter echoed faintly against the cold concrete. Seated in those chairs were the mummified remains of the Murphy family, still dressed in the clothes they wore in the video. The mother's hand rested on her husband's arm. The children's heads were tilted slightly toward the screen, as if they were still watching. A small notebook lay on the floor. Inside, the handwriting of the father, John Murphy, told a story of descent. It started with simple journal entries, but his words grew darker. He wrote about losing his job, about fights, and about his consuming fear of his family being separated. The last entries, written in a shaky hand, were almost illegible. He claimed God had told him to keep the family together forever. The final entry read, "Tonight we'll finally stay home." Toxicology confirmed they had been poisoned with sedatives mixed into their food, but John's body wasn't in the room. He was found in the upstairs bedroom, a gun in his hand. He had stayed alive just long enough to build the hidden wall and set up the looping video before taking his own life. Neighbors later recalled seeing lights flicker in the basement window late at night, always at 8:07 p.m. the exact time, according to the video's timestamp that the family would sing happy birthday to their youngest child. The house still stands, empty and unsold, a place where a family dinner never ends. Our next story takes us to Salt Lake City in 2011. A real estate agent named Dana Holt was prepping a foreclosed property for sale. The house was at the end of a long, cracked driveway, abandoned for nearly a decade. As she walked toward the front door, she heard a strange, rhythmic, whispering sound. It seemed to come from beneath her feet. When she stopped, the sound stopped. When she moved, it started again. She and a maintenance worker both pressed their ears to the ground and swore they could hear muffled, overlapping voices. Authorities were called, and when they broke up a section of the driveway, they uncovered a shallow pit. It was filled with dozens of sealed plastic containers, each holding a cassette tape labeled with a date and a set of coordinates. The earliest was from 1996, the latest from 2008. When investigators played the first tape, what they heard was chilling. Each recording began with the hum of a car engine, followed by a calm male voice asking, "Do you remember where we met?" Then came the sound of karanga, man, a woman, sometimes a child. The recordings all ended abruptly, with long stretches of silence. The coordinates led police to remote, desolate locations, abandoned mineshafts, dried-up wells, and unmarked patches of desert. At each site, they found human remains. The victims were a mix of men, women, and children, most unidentified, their disappearances never connected until now. The house belonged to a man named Clyde Rowe, a former sound engineer who had died in a car accident in 2009. His neighbors knew him as a quiet man who kept to himself. But in his garage, investigators found a sophisticated sound mixing board and audio equipment. Clyde wasn't just recording his victims, he was editing their final moments. He had isolated their cries of fear, layered them, and mixed them into complex, horrifying audio tracks. These weren't just recordings, they were compositions. He had turned the sound of human terror into his own private music. Over 40 tapes were found, but police believe there could be more, buried under other driveways, waiting to be discovered. The whispers Dana heard were the final, haunting echoes of Clyde's victims. Their voices trapped beneath the concrete, a symphony of fear that had been playing in silence for years. These stories are a stark reminder that the deepest horrors often hide in plain sight, in a quiet neighbor, a loving father, or beneath the very ground we walk on. The evidence is there, but the why remains locked away in the minds of those who committed these acts, leaving only questions and a lingering sense of dread. Thank you for joining me in exploring these dark corners of human history. If you found this video compelling, please consider liking and subscribing for more deep dives into the unknown. Stay safe and stay aware. Have you ever walked into a house and felt like you weren't alone? That feeling of being watched, of a story lingering in the air, heavy and unspoken. The three tales we about to explore are born from places just like that, where ordinary homes and quiet roads hide secrets so dark they refuse to be buried. These aren't just ghost stories. They're echoes of real tragedies, of mysteries that defy simple explanation. From a family dinner that never ends to whispers trapped beneath concrete, these accounts will make you question what truly lies hidden just beneath the surface of our world. Our first story takes us to the outskirts of Salt Lake City in 2011. A real estate agent named Dana Holt was getting an old foreclosed property ready for sale. The house had been abandoned for almost a decade, sitting at the end of a long, cracked driveway, surrounded by overgrown grass and rusting garden tools. Dana was a seasoned pro. She'd seen her share of neglected homes and wasn't easily rattled. But as she walked toward the front door, she heard something strange. It was a faint whispering sound, almost like wind, but it was rhythmic, deliberate. When she stopped moving, the sound stopped too. When she took another step, it started again. It seemed to be coming from right beneath her feet. At first, she dismissed it. Maybe it was just air escaping through cracks in the concrete, or a broken pipe. But when she mentioned it to a maintenance worker later that week, he heard it too. Both of them knelt down, pressing their ears to the ground. They swore they could hear voices muffled, distant, and overlapping, as if several people were whispering at once. Unsettled, Dana called the authorities, reporting a possible gas leak. But what they found when they broke up a section of that driveway turned the property into one of Utah's darkest and most chilling mysteries. Beneath the concrete, they discovered a shallow pit filled with dozens of sealed plastic containers, each about the size of a small lunchbox. Inside every container was a cassette tape, labeled in black marker with a date and a set of coordinates. The earliest tape was dated 1996. The latest was from 2008. When investigators played the first few tapes, what they heard was so disturbing that several of them had to leave the room. Each recording began the exact same way, with the faint hum of a car engine, followed by a calm male voice asking, "Do you remember where we met?" Then, the sound of crying would begin, sometimes a man, sometimes a woman, sometimes a child. Each recording ended abruptly, with long stretches of silence, as if the tape had just kept running after the microphone was dropped. Forensics teams immediately began cross-referencing the coordinates written on the tapes. Every single location matched a missing person case from Utah or a neighboring state. 7 cases in total aligned perfectly. These people had vanished without a trace over a 12-year span, and none of their remains had ever been recovered. It didn't take long for investigators to link the property to a man named Clyde Rowe, who had owned the land until 2008. Rowe had been a highway maintenance supervisor, responsible for rest stops, roadside cameras, and repair stations across several counties. He lived alone, had no family, no friends to speak of, and had disappeared himself just 2 years before the discovery of the tapes. As detectives dug into his past, they found something deeply unsettling. During his employment, Rowe had filed multiple travelogues showing he was on site at nearly all the locations, marked on the cassette labels always within days of a reported disappearance. Yet, there was no physical evidence of abduction, no witnesses, and no fingerprints left behind. His truck was eventually located at the bottom of a nearby lake, its doors locked from the inside. Tucked away in the glove compartment was a note, written in the same handwriting as the tape labels. It said, "They all came to me willingly." Audio specialists analyzing the tapes noticed one final, disturbing pattern. The whispering sounds that Dana had first heard beneath the driveway, those same ghostly murmurs were present faintly in the background of every single recording, almost like an echo from the same spot. When investigators compared the acoustic signatures, they came to a horrifying realization. The voices on the tapes were recorded right there in that driveway, perhaps even underground. But no trace of human remains was ever found on the property, and the origin of the whispering was never officially explained. Some theorized it was just the sound of air escaping through the empty containers, but others believed the soil itself held something that couldn't be measured, an echo of the victim's final moments. The property was later paved over, sold, and rebuilt, but every new owner has reported the same thing. When the sun sets and the air cools, the driveway whispers again, and if you listen too long, they say the voices start to form words, please, names, and faint, chilling laughter that doesn't belong to the living. Our next story comes from the quiet desert highways of Arizona. In 2015, a retired couple, Walter and June Miller, were driving through the vast, empty landscape when they decided to stop for the night at a small roadside motel. It was the only place for miles, a faded 2-story building with a flickering neon sign that simply read Sunset Inn. The parking lot was empty, save for a single old pickup truck. When they entered the front office, they found no clerk, just a bell on the counter and a note taped to the register that said, "Room 12 is ready." The key was already hanging on a hook right beneath it. Exhausted and too tired to question the strange setup, the Millers took the key and checked themselves in. The room was old but surprisingly clean. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and something else. Something metallic, like rust. A single painting hung above the bed, a faded landscape of desert hills. Everything seemed normal enough until around 3 in the morning. Walter woke to a faint scratching sound coming from behind the headboard. It was steady and soft, like fingernails dragging on wood. Thinking it was just an animal, he turned on the lamp and pressed his ear against the wall. The scratching stopped. A few minutes later, it started again, this time closer to the floor, followed by a faint, rhythmic tapping. June slept through the whole thing, and Walter eventually convinced himself it was just old pipes or desert rats. They packed up and left at dawn, without mentioning it to anyone. Later that morning, they stopped at a small diner down the road. While chatting with a local police officer, Walter brought up the strange sounds from the motel, half joking that the place might be haunted. The officer's expression immediately soured. He told them the Sunset Inn had been officially closed for nearly a year. It had been shut down after a series of complaints from guests who had heard whispers and a scratching coming from inside their walls. Worse, no one had been able to reach the owner for months. Disturbed by the Miller's story, the officer decided to go check it out himself. What he discovered was a crime scene frozen in time. The owner had been murdered, his body hidden inside the wall between room 12 and the adjacent room. Forensics determined he had been alive for some time after being sealed in, desperately scratching and tapping, trying to get someone's attention before he finally succumbed. The police theorized that the killer was a drifter who had continued to run the motel remotely, leaving keys for unsuspecting travelers and collecting cash left on the counter. The only clue was the old pickup truck in the parking lot, which turned out to be stolen. The killer was never found. The Sunset Inn still stands, abandoned and decaying under the Arizona sun. But locals say that if you be brave enough to pull over and listen closely to the walls of room 12, you can still hear him, scratching, tapping, still trying to get out. Our final story is perhaps the most tragic and unsettling of all. In 2008, police in a quiet suburban neighborhood were called to do a welfare check on the Murphy family. No one had seen or heard from them in over a week, which was highly unusual. When officers arrived, the house was dark and silent. They forced their way in and began to search. The ground floor was tidy, almost unnaturally so, but in the basement they noticed something odd. One of the concrete walls looked newer than the others, its texture slightly different. Suspecting something was wrong, they broke through it. Behind the wall was a hidden, windowless room. The air was stale and cold. In the center of the room, a mother and her 3 children were sitting on a sofa, facing a television set. They looked like they were simply watching a movie, but they were all deceased. On the screen, a home video was playing on a loop, a clip from the youngest child's last birthday party. The family was gathered around a cake, smiling and singing happy birthday. Nearby, a small notebook lay on the ground. The handwriting inside belonged to John Murphy, the father. The first few pages were simple journal entries, grocery lists, weather updates, but as the pages turned, his words grew darker. He wrote about losing his job, about arguments that escalated, and finally, about his terror of being separated from his family. The last entries were almost illegible, written in shaky, desperate pen strokes. He claimed that God had told him to keep the family together forever. The final, chilling entry read, "Tonight we'll finally stay home." Toxicology tests later confirmed that the mother and children had been poisoned with a high dose of sedatives mixed into their food. But John's body wasn't in the hidden room with them. Officers discovered him in the upstairs bedroom, lying on the bed, a gun still in his hand. It appeared he had stayed alive just long enough to build that hidden wall, set up the looping video, and seal his family away before ending his own life. Investigators noted the eerie, chilling precision of it all. Every detail had been arranged to preserve the illusion of a happy, unified family. There were no signs of a struggle, no forced entry. Neighbors later told police they had occasionally seen lights flicker in the basement window late at night. Always at the same time, 8:07 p.m. It was the exact moment, according to the timestamp on the video, when the family would sing happy birthday to their youngest child. For years after the discovery, officers who revisited the property reported hearing faint music whenever they entered the basement, even though the television had long since been removed. The house still stands today, empty and unsold. Its front door chained shut, and locals say that if you drive past after dark, you might just see a faint glow flickering behind the boarded-up windows, as if the Murphys are still down there, watching themselves forever, waiting for the next family dinner that will never come. Thank you so much for joining me for these unsettling stories. If tales of the strange and mysterious are what you seek, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more. Stay safe out there, and see you next time. Hello, and welcome. Tonight we're venturing into the shadows, exploring 2 chilling tales from forgotten corners of America. One is a story of a roadside motel where the walls had eyes, and the other is a ghost town in Alaska, swallowed by ice and secrets. These stories remind us that sometimes, the most unsettling mysteries are the ones hiding in plain sight, just off the main road, or buried under a layer of snow. So, turn down the lights, get comfortable, and let's journey into the heart of these modern-day legends. Our first story takes us to a nondescript motel, the kind you might pass on any lonely highway. For one couple, the Millers, it was supposed to be a simple, overnight stop, but they were about to stumble upon a secret that had been festering within the walls for decades. When the Millers checked in, they felt an immediate sense of unease. The elderly owner seemed distracted, almost distant, and the air in their room felt heavy and stagnant. That night, Mr. Miller was kept awake by a faint, persistent scratching sound, seemingly coming from inside the wall, behind their bed. He tried to ignore it, dismissing it as mice or the old building settling. But then, he saw a flicker of movement through a tiny crack near the headboard. It was a glint of light, like an eye peering through the darkness. Unsettled, they left in the middle of the night and called the police from a payphone down the road. When officers arrived at the motel, the scene was just as the Millers had described. The office was empty, but the key to room 12 was conspicuously missing from its hook. Inside the room, everything looked ordinary. It was clean, the bed was made, and there was no sign of disturbance. But the officers remembered the Millers' story about the headboard. When they pulled it away from the wall, their investigation took a dark turn. There, cut neatly into the drywall, was a small, square hole. Behind it, a narrow crawl space stretched the entire length of the building. This wasn't just some structural quirk. The space had been deliberately modified. Makeshift plywood panels lined the walls, and dotted along them were small, coin-sized holes, each one perfectly drilled to offer a clear view into the guest rooms. It was a secret, hidden network of surveillance. Old extension cords snaked along the dusty floor, all leading to a single destination, a sealed basement door. Officers had to pry it open, and what they found inside was a chilling workshop of voyeurism. The small room was a mess of broken monitors, tangled cables, and a dusty, old reel-to-reel recorder. On a shelf sat dozens of VHS tapes, meticulously labeled with room numbers and dates. The contents of those tapes were horrifying. Many contained grainy night vision footage of guests, completely unaware they were being watched as they slept. The recordings were silent, intimate, and deeply violating. Some tapes had been rewound and played so many times that the magnetic strips were worn down. The images faded to almost nothing. But as investigators sifted through the collection, they found something even more disturbing. Some tapes showed empty rooms, filmed for hours on end. At first, it seemed pointless. But then, a flicker of movement, a shadow crawling within the walls, a hand pressing against the thin plywood, just inches away from where guests were sleeping peacefully. The watcher wasn't just watching. He was in the walls with them. In a dark corner of the basement, the search team found a bedroll, some old food wrappers, and a torn shirt. This shirt was later identified as belonging to a hitchhiker who had been reported missing months earlier. His last known location, this very motel. His wallet and ID were found buried in a shoebox hidden under the floorboards. The owner, an elderly man named Gerald Tuck, was nowhere to be found. The pickup truck the Millers had seen parked outside was later discovered, abandoned at a gas station 20 miles away. Gerald had simply vanished. As the story unfolded, investigators learned more about the quiet, reclusive motel owner. Gerald Tuck had once been a photographer, but his passion had twisted into an obsession with capturing real moments. He bought the motel in the 1980s, after his wife passed away, and lived there in solitude. Regular guests and locals remembered him as eccentric, often seen wandering the property with a camera, filming sunsets or the faces of strangers. He'd told them he was building a collection. No one could have imagined just how literal he meant that. The motel was shut down for good, its secrets exposed. But some stories don't end just because a building is boarded up. People who drive past the derelict motel at night claim they sometimes see a faint blue glow flickering in the window of room 12, and if they stop and listen, on a quiet night, they say you can still hear it as slow, steady scratching coming from inside the walls. Now, let's travel north, far north, to the frozen expanse of Alaska, where our second story unfolds. In the winter of 1984, a brutal blizzard scoured the northern coast, tearing away layers of snow and ice that had been untouched for years. As a crew of snowplow workers cleared an old abandoned road, they noticed something odd. Sticking up from the frozen ground were several wooden crosses, tilted and half buried. Their first thought was that they'd stumbled upon an old, forgotten cemetery. But when investigators returned after the spring thaw, they knew this was something else entirely. These graves weren't normal. There were 14 crosses in total, each crudely carved with just a first name and a number. No last names, no dates of birth or death. And according to official records, no cemetery had ever existed in this desolate area. This strange discovery led researchers down a rabbit hole into the history of a ghost town called St. Enoch, a remote settlement that had been wiped from most maps decades ago. The village had once been home to a small community of trappers and fishermen, but it had been mysteriously abandoned in the mid-1980s, with no explanation for the mass exodus. Most of the buildings in St. Enoch had been crushed by years of heavy snow, their wooden frames collapsing into ruin. Only one structure remained partially intact, a small wooden church, its steeple bent but stubbornly standing against the harsh landscape. When the investigation team stepped inside, the air was cold and musty. Snow had drifted through broken windows, covering the pews and floor in a white blanket. At the front of the room, an altar was coated in a thick layer of dust, with candles melted into grotesque, waxy shapes. Behind the pulpit, they found a large wooden chest, bound shut with a heavy chain and padlock. With a pair of bolt cutters, they broke the lock and opened the chest. Inside, it wasn't filled with religious artifacts or historical records. It was filled with children's things, small, handcrafted toys, faded hair ribbons, and a stack of hand-drawn pictures. Every single drawing depicted the same unsettling image. A tall, slender man with a blank, featureless face, dressed in a long black coat, standing next to a swing set. Some of the drawings had names scrawled in a child's shaky handwriting. Emily, Thomas, Ruth. Investigators checked the names against census and school records for the village. None of them appeared. In fact, the most disturbing discovery was that, according to all surviving records, there were no children living in St. Enoch during the time these graves were estimated to have been made. The town's only school had been closed for years due to a lack of students. The town's last known religious leader was a man named Pastor Elijah Crane. Old letters from former residents described him as a devoted and charismatic man who had moved to St. Enoch from Anchorage in the late 1970s. He quickly became the spiritual center of the isolated community. Parishioners wrote that he was a caretaker for the lost, and he would often travel to nearby towns. claiming to adopt orphans and bring them to the settlement for a proper raising. None of those children were ever registered or seen by anyone outside the village. Pastor Crane himself vanished in 1985, right after a massive storm cut St. Enoch off from the rest of the world for weeks. When rescue teams finally managed to reach the village, they found it completely empty. Every home was abandoned, with doors left wide open. The only sign of recent activity was a single line of footprints leading from the church, deep into the surrounding forest, where they simply stopped. Inside Crane's old living quarters, investigators found his personal ledger. It was filled with lists of children's names, each one paired with a biblical reference and a number. Every name in the ledger matched a name on one of the 14 crosses in the graveyard. The very last entry was a short, chilling message: "They are with him now. My work is complete." When the graves were finally exhumed, the final, horrifying piece of the puzzle fell into place. The coffins were empty. There were no bodies, no remains. Each one was filled only with a few toys and a set of neatly folded children's clothing. The children had never been buried there. Locals from other settlements had long spoken of strange lights in the woods near St. Enoch, and the faint sound of laughter carried on the wind. To this day, no one knows what truly happened. Did the pastor lead the children into the forest to perish in the cold? Or was it all part of some twisted ritual that we can't even begin to comprehend? Over the years, several attempts were made to develop the area, but they were all mysteriously abandoned. Construction crews reported constant equipment malfunctions, sudden power failures, and unsettling sounds echoing through the trees after dark. Eventually, the site was officially sealed off, and the name St. Enoch was erased from modern maps, as if to bury the memory forever. But some things can't be erased. Pilots who fly over that remote part of Alaska at night still report seeing strange, faint lights on the ground, violet tiny flickers in the endless snow, lined up in a neat row, like candles marking a grave. And they say that when the wind is just right, it carries a sound that defies explanation, the distant, haunting melody of children singing softly, a song that fades the very moment you try to listen. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the unknown. If you enjoyed these stories, please don't forget to like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more explorations into the world's most fascinating mysteries. Stay curious, and we'll see you next time.